Thank you, Kaz, for that introduction and the plug for my book. And I am glad to be with you all today. This is my first time actually speaking in Mosaic, and I see a number of familiar names and faces from people who've been in class with me, and then a lot of you who I don't know yet, but good to be with you and to be able to speak on this subject. So last week, Dr. Cha had like big picture, giving you just some of the different concepts, some of the statistics, and I'm going to go the other direction. I'm going to mainly zero in on sort of the micro level of more individual stories, and quite frankly, telling some of my own experience and observations with diaspora and how God has used various aspects of the diaspora for his purposes. So just again, as maybe a quick refresher, according to the United Nations, right now we're talking about 281 million people who are living outside their country of origin. So these would be first generation. We're not talking about second generation, third generation. So that is an increase from, say, in the year 2000, for example, that number was 220 million roughly. So currently, international immigrants represent 3.6% of the world's population. So that comes out to about 1 in 28 people on planet Earth. So, and a lot of you in this room right now, if you're an international student, you would fall into that number. So we're really talking about a huge phenomenon and a scale unprecedented. There's always been human migrations and movements of people, but what we're experiencing today is really unprecedented, the level that we're at. Now, 84 million of those are forced displaced people, what we might call refugees. They're people who did not intend, they did not want to leave their homeland. There's war, there's persecution, there's famine, and so on and so forth. And that number is up from, say, 2015, 7 years ago, that number is up about 30%. So we are talking again about numbers that are really unprecedented as a global phenomenon. So what does this mean for God's mission? And so throughout history, we know that God has used these movements of people. Kaz mentioned the persecution of the church in Jerusalem and God using that so that the gospel moved outside of Jerusalem into places that it had not been. I think you're going to have a talk later, maybe more about sort of a biblical theology. But if we just go through scripture, we're going to see Abraham, he's called to leave his homeland. Israel in Egypt, the Babylonian captivity of Judah being taken off by their conquerors. Daniel, of course, and his friends in Babylon. Jesus is a refugee child fleeing to Egypt. The Roman centurion Cornelius, this is an interesting story. He's probably one of the first Gentile converts to Christianity. Now, how did he get there? Well, he's a Roman soldier who gets stationed in Palestine. And there, you know, he's a God-fearer, comes into contact with Peter, becomes one of the first Gentiles and believers. And of course, the Apostle Paul, he's a diaspora Jew. So he's Jewish, he grows up in Tarsus. He actually becomes a sort of a bicultural person. So he's got his Jewish heritage, learns the law of Moses and so on, rabbinic instruction, and yet he grows up in the Greek-speaking world. He's conversant in Greek philosophies. We see him quoting Greek philosophers in Athens. He's this bicultural person, and God used that in Paul's life to prepare him to be a missionary to the Greek-speaking world. I don't know about some of you who you've grown up in different cultures, you've grown up speaking different languages. Maybe God's using that to prepare you to be a person who is versatile, who's able to adapt to other cultures or in a similar way. Priscilla and Aquila, the Jews are expelled from Rome. They end up down in Corinth and they meet up with Paul and they become part of Paul's missionary team. Was that something they planned? I don't think so. And yet God used that. So we just see throughout scripture, God moving people around and then using that for his own purposes to glorify himself. And some of those situations would have been, humanly speaking, tragic. Well, in the world of missions today, for probably the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of talk about what we call diaspora missiology. And that's really sort of asking the question, what does this mean today that there are so many people living outside of their homeland for all kinds of reasons? What does this mean for the spread of the gospel? What does this mean? What are the implications of this for God's mission? And there are a lot of different ways we can answer that question. I'm just going to focus in on 3 different ways that get talked about a lot. And that's going to be sort of the frame of my talk. I don't have a PowerPoint, but the 3 ways that we sometimes talk about diaspora mission is mission to the diaspora, mission by the diaspora, and then mission through the diaspora. So I'm going to explain those 3 different kind of ways of looking at the opportunities that God has opened up. And I'm going to just give you some personal examples, some concrete examples of this that I've observed or been involved in myself. So let's start out with mission to the diaspora. So what we mean by this is people who are not Christians who have relocated to a place where they come into contact with Christians. That might be somebody like Cornelius, a Roman centurion who moves to Palestine, comes in contact with the gospel. Very often they are people who come from countries or locations where there are very few Christians, or there are restrictions. They might come from the Arab world, the Muslim world. They might come from China, mainland China, places where there are very few Christians and they would have not had any contact with the gospel. But they come to a place like America where there's all kinds of freedom. They come into contact with Christians. And so we talk about reaching out to immigrant populations with the gospel, international students, international business people, refugees who now have come into proximity with the gospel. And there are just no limit to the examples of this. I think of the Islamic Revolution, if we go back to early 1980s when Iran became a Muslim Sharia law state. There were many Muslims who left the country. They did not want to live under Sharia law. Many of them came to Europe. Today there are Iranian churches in places like Belgium, where one of our own Trinity doctoral students had worked for a while, reaching out to Iranians living in Belgium. There are churches today with Iranians who very probably would not have come into contact with the gospel if they had remained in their homeland. When I was working in Germany in the town of Neumarkt, there was a hotel. It was an old hotel that had been sort of converted into a refugee home. Ironically, it was called Hotel Wunder, and Wunder means in Germany miracle. So this is like Miracle Hotel. Well, there were mostly people from Ghana in the beginning, and we had sort of a little Bible study group going with them. Now they were mostly Christians, and then there were refugees there were political people who were being politically persecuted from Nigeria, but then there came people from Iran and from the Middle East. Now we would have these meetings sort of in the open area. Sometimes we'd show the Jesus film or just have Bible study. And then one time I was making just a private visit there with somebody. And as I'm walking through the hall, the door opens up and one of the Iranians sort of sticks his head out. He looks left and right. And he says, "Can I talk to you a minute?" So clearly he didn't want to be seen talking to me. I said, "Sure, what can I do for you?" He says, "Can you get me a Bible? Can you get me a Bible in my language?" Very simple little example of somebody who was actually fearful that even other Iranians in the building might see him asking for a Bible. So I got him a Bible. I actually got another Bible for the leader of kind of the head guy of the Iranian group there, but just a simple example. When we were in Munich, this was in the 1990s, and there was the war in the Balkans, civil war in the Balkans, former Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union had crumbled. The communist governments are toppling everywhere, and there's civil war. And there were roughly about 70,000 refugees or people who had come to Munich, this is just in Munich, from the former Yugoslavia, so Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and so on. And we were able to minister to some of those people. Now, here's just a multi-leveled story that will illustrate this mission to the diaspora. So there's a woman named Liliana. She was from the former Yugoslavia, grew up atheist. It's a communist country. You're not supposed to be involved with religion. She was kind of curious. She actually, as a younger girl, she stole the Bible from the library because she was just kind of curious, like, well, what's this all about? She steals the Bible, kind of reads some of it, doesn't get a whole lot. She feels kind of guilty. She returned the Bible. Years later, she immigrates to Germany with her sister, her mother, and her daughter. So these 4 women, they immigrate to Germany. Now the daughter is going to German schools. It's kind of struggling. Well, we have this guy in our church. He's also a diaspora Christian. He's an Indian. He was from a Brahmin Hindu priestly family in Calcutta, one of the most important priestly families in Calcutta. He had come as a student to Germany and became a Christian through student ministry in Germany, ended up marrying a German woman, stayed in Germany. But he had a real heart for others who had come. So he began tutoring, doing volunteer tutoring for these various people that were in the schools struggling. So he gets connected with Liliana's daughter and begins tutoring her, and they make the connection, and they ended up visiting our church. And then my wife ended up having an evangelistic Bible study with these women. And after it took about 2 years. And then, as they put it, sort of the penny dropped, and it's like, wow. And they embraced Jesus. It was actually kind of humorous because like she's saying, well, why didn't you tell us this 2 years ago? Why didn't you explain that? Said, well, we've been saying the same thing for 2 years, but it's like the Holy Spirit just said, okay, now's the time. And in any case, so these are just simple, small personal stories. We could tell bigger stories. For example, roughly around 1990, before the Iron Curtain fell, there were only around 35 or 40,000 Jews living in Germany. And you can imagine why, with the history of Germany. Well, when the Iron Curtain came down, there was a mass immigration of Eastern Europeans that came west. And in particular, between 1991, when the wall came down, and 2006, about a 15-year period, there was 250,000 Eastern European Jews who migrated living in Germany, of all places. Most of them were secular Jews. And we actually, through just one of these amazing circumstances, one of these people came, they didn't have any place to stay. They didn't know where to go. Somebody said, go talk to this businessman in this department store. This businessman was a member of our church. Just so happened he had a little sort of a one-room apartment type thing that he would sometimes rent out. And he was able to take these refugees in, and the husband was Jewish. And long story short, we ended up baptizing him, and he became a believer. And today, there are about 40 different Messianic Jewish congregations who believe in Jesus as Messiah in Germany. Who would have thought, of all places, that there would be this movement to Jesus among diaspora Jews? And I could tell another story about Sudanese refugees who ended up in Kenya and Uganda in camps, who became Christians in large numbers in those refugee camps. They returned to Sudan. I was actually in southern Sudan before it was southern Sudan. It was all one Sudan, and was doing some ministry there in southern Sudan, and seeing these little churches of the people who had returned from the refugee camps. And now there were churches in southern Sudan where there were not churches before. So these are just a few examples of ministry to the diaspora right now. And my world, I served in Germany, and I go back every year and minister, but there's roughly 1.2 million refugees, just refugees, not international business people or students, about 1.2 million refugees living in Germany right now, most of them from Syria. In 1 year, they took in 1 million refugees, most of them from Syria. And today there are churches being planted, big churches, 100 plus people for Germany, that's a big church, among Syrian refugees. God moved those people into proximity of the gospel. There were those local Christians who had the vision to see that as an opportunity and to reach out to them. And then once you give them the ball, they run with it. And once people have found Christ and the hope he gives and the light way he changes their lives, they become the evangelists, and the gospel message sort of spreads. Well, this is ministry to the diaspora. This is what many people will think of, ministering to those people who have relocated and are now in proximity to where we can share the gospel. And I know that there's at least one of you out there who's had that sort of experience, and maybe you can tell your story in a group discussion later. Now, what do we mean by mission by the diaspora? Well, this is kind of the reverse, where Christians relocate somewhere else. So we talked about the persecution of the Jerusalem Christians who scattered, they go into Judea. Some of them end up in this very pagan city of Antioch and share the gospel wherever they go. So this would be a case where Christians are moving into other parts of the world where there are few Christians and very little gospel witness. Now, a couple examples of this, and some of this I've observed firsthand. I've not been directly involved in it, but there are roughly 10 million Filipinos, mostly Christians, who are working outside of the Philippines. Some of them are working in the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. Now, that is a country where they do not have religious freedom, and it's very difficult for people there to come into contact with the gospel. Some of them are domestic workers in places like Hong Kong or Singapore. So you've got these Filipinos, many of them who are Christians, and they're going into places where there are few Christians. There's actually training centers in the Philippines with like these intensive 1 week sort of crash course on how to be a witness to Muslims when you go to work in Saudi Arabia or wherever you end up. So they're actually very intentionally mobilizing people who will be going internationally for longer or short term, usually some form of employment, to these various locations where there will be opportunity to be a witness for Christ. Now, obviously, it's going to take some wisdom on to know how to do this well. One of our doctoral students actually here in our PhD ICS program actually did his PhD research interviewing Filipino, he himself was from the Philippines, interviewing Filipino domestic workers. So these are mostly younger women who've gone to Hong Kong and they're serving as au pair, childcare, housekeeping, this sort of thing. And he was interviewed at focus groups with numerous of these women, trying to determine how much influence are they having for the gospel. Many of them had been trained in these training programs before they went to Hong Kong. And it's a mixed story. It is not easy. In their case, many of them just aren't respected. Filipinos are just kind of looked down upon as lower class. And so it's difficult for them to have an influence in the families where they're serving. But some of them have really had very positive influence, praying for their families, telling Bible stories to the children, inviting their hosts to church, and so on. And so there's been positive influence, but it is a challenge. And there is, in many of these cases, there's abuse and some very horrible stories to be told. So we shouldn't look at that there have been cases where these domestic workers have gone to certain countries and they can't get back out of the country. They incur debt and they become basically enslaved. So there are risks in those types of arrangements, but nevertheless, an intentional desire to mobilize these workers that go out into these parts of the world. By the way, while I was in Hong Kong for a training a couple of years ago, I was invited by a guy who was planting churches among Indonesian internationals. So I said, why don't you come and speak at my church? And so I go, well, first of all, you drive into this neighborhood on Sunday, and most of these domestic workers get Sunday off. So all the Indonesian, they're all women, they're all meeting on the streets. I mean, they're just crowded under bridges and streets and meeting, happy to be with other Indonesians. And so we go right in that community where all these people are hanging out, and he's got a little church going. First time I ever preached in a church, it was all women. And sure enough, they have this church of women, Indonesian domestic workers. And he started a church like this in Hong Kong and Singapore and in a couple of other places. And it was really interesting. They had dance, and they of course have a meal together afterwards, and celebrate their language and their culture and all this sort of thing. But it was a tremendous opportunity for the gospel to reach out to those people from a predominantly Muslim country. There's also what we sometimes call reverse mission. I don't especially like that term, but the idea is where you have particularly some of these African Pentecostal churches, as an example, who are literally sending missionaries in reverse back to what would have been the sending countries like the US or Europe. Latin Americans from Brazil sending missionaries to Portugal. Spanish-speaking countries in South America sending missionaries to Spain, and so on. And so the old countries that used to be sending the missionaries are now so secularized, they're receiving missionaries from these former so-called mission fields. So this is a phenomenon that's been growing. This is part of this sort of mission by the diaspora, as God moves Christians into proximity with non-Christians. By the way, most of the studies, and we've had a couple of our PhD students doing research on this sort of reverse mission phenomenon. And what we're finding out, there are a few exceptions, but usually those missionaries are doing well reaching other immigrants. They have a harder time reaching, for lack of a better word, mainstream American citizens. Very often those churches are very culturally African, with dance and music and so on, that many Americans just don't probably feel very comfortable with. But they are doing a good job of reaching other immigrants. The hope for many of these reverse mission sort of efforts is to actually bring revival back to Europe or to America. We're not seeing that yet, but of course the demographics are shifting very, very rapidly. As you know, Dr. Chaw, I think, mentioned this, that even the United States will not be a Caucasian population, European descent population. The US will no longer be 51%. It will be much more diverse than it is now. So we'll have to see where that actually all ends up. But this is what we're talking about, mission by the diaspora. And then sort of the third way we talk about it is mission through the diaspora. And what do we mean by that? Well, this is sort of a little bit of both. And this would be, I'll give you a very specific example. Chinese person, not a Christian, comes to the US to study engineering. He becomes a Christian here. And I'm thinking, I've got a name for this, but I'm not going to tell you his name. He comes to study engineering in the US, becomes a Christian, and then goes to seminary, feels God's calling him. Now, this is a big sacrifice. Some of you Asians will know this. He was the oldest son. And the oldest son is supposed to pay for the siblings to then get their education and so on, or provide for their parents in retirement. So here he's taking this engineering degree and not using it. So this is a big decision for him to do this. So he goes to seminary. Long story short, he ends up then becoming a missionary back to China. So you had sort of a mission to the diaspora when he becomes a Christian here, then it's sort of mission by the diaspora as he goes back to China. Now, this is a phenomenon. Many of them are doing it on a short-term basis. They might go back for 6 months or for short-term trips back to their homeland. We think of Mexicans who've come to the US. And by the way, the Assemblies of God, one of the largest denominations in the US, roughly, I think, a third, and they've got something like 3 million members, roughly a third of all of their congregants are immigrant congregations or immigrants. This is a growth. There's a much greater likelihood of a Mexican becoming a Christian in the US than in Mexico. But some of them will become a Christian here. They'll go back, share the gospel with their families. This is what we mean by mission through the diaspora. We have another one of our doctoral students who just is getting ready to graduate. Some of you may know Brian Woods. And he did a study. He had worked in Vietnam. And his study was of Vietnamese, basically, for the most part, American Vietnamese, who were maybe their 1.5 generation. They were children after the Vietnam War. Their parents brought them to America. And others who have since immigrated to America, become American citizens, but God has laid on their heart to minister back in Vietnam. And some of them didn't really want to do that, but had a conviction they should do it. And so he interviewed a lot of these people that were going back, some of them longer term, some of them short term, to minister in Vietnam. Now, there are Christians in Vietnam, but still quite a minority. And so this is a phenomenon. I worked with some people. I've been to Vietnam a couple of times. There's a typical case. They were members of a big church in California. He had a very flourishing business there. He was a businessman. They both come more or less as children. In the wake of the Vietnam War, they were brought to America. And then just God laid it on their hearts. You need to go back. So they moved back to Vietnam. Now, one of the challenges they face is their Vietnamese is like, 30-year-old or longer Vietnamese. It's not the modern Vietnamese that people are speaking today. And maybe their grammar isn't as good as it used to be, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes that creates kind of this curious thing, like, if I go to China and I say ni hao or xi or something, people go, oh, how wonderful. If a Chinese American goes to China and doesn't speak perfect Mandarin, it's like, what's your problem? So this is sometimes a bit of a challenge for the sort of mission through the diaspora. That is a cross-cultural experience. Those Vietnamese people are going back. It's not the Vietnam they left. And sometimes they may be looked down on. Why did you leave our country in a time of crisis? And so there are special challenges with this mission through the diaspora. Well, I've just given you kind of some micro snapshots of mission to the diaspora, mission by the diaspora, mission through the diaspora, and how God is using these different aspects of human migration for his own purposes. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I'm not sure Kaz, who is going to moderate at this point, but I had given several discussion questions, and I don't know if those are going to go on the screen or whatever, relating to this, but to share a story that you might know of mission by, to, or through the diaspora, and then maybe what you see as opportunities or challenges to this. So I'm going to conclude my part at that, and we'll let you take it over.